When I started producing this video, I had these grand plans. I was in Toronto for a few nights, so I made my way to Toronto Union Station. I planned my shots, I recorded some video, and I thought I had all the footage I needed to put together this month's update. It turns out the audio didn't work. Nevertheless, in this update, we're going to talk about how progress on the layout has slowed and what I'm going to do about it. We'll briefly touch on the Doubleheaders layout tour, and we'll take a look at some purchases, some gifts, and some railroad memorabilia I've added to the train room. Here is the April 2024 update. Let's get started. So as I mentioned in the introduction, progress on the layout has slowed. And it's not a lack of motivation that the layout has slowed, it's a lack of information. The challenge is that many of the things I want to do simply aren't easy. Case in point, my version of Union Station. I have spent hours designing and planning this station, and the original plan was to make a prototype-inspired version of Toronto's Union Station and to match the prototype as closely as possible. But over the past few months, what I've realized is the amount of planning and effort that go into trying to recreate the prototype maybe isn't the approach I want to take. While I am interested in prototype modeling, I'm also interested in seeing things completed. And therefore, I'm okay with compromise. So, with that, I had a trip planned to Toronto, and I decided I would spend one of the mornings downtown gathering a bit more information about the platforms in the train shed. There were a few details that I wanted to research. First, how the rails were ballasted and how they transitioned into the platforms. Specifically platforms 3 and 4, where there was a double rail area without a center passenger platform. This is far more representative of the station platforms that I'm building, and I wanted to see how those tracks were finished. The platforms themselves, how the yellow warning areas were applied, and how the end of the platforms transitioned into the yard ballast. The roof supports. These are one of the defining features of Toronto Union Station and the principal element I want to model accurately. I wanted to see how they were interconnected and how they were mounted onto the platforms themselves. And finally, the stairwells that took passengers from the platforms to below the station. There's different examples depending upon where you are in the station, and I wanted to find something that I could model easily and still be effective. So some of the basic things that I learned. The tracks were ballasted with dark cinders. The warning strips were well over a foot wide on each of the platforms, and the end of the platforms just disappeared into the ballast at the yard ends. There was many different modifications to the roof supports. There were girders that ran parallel to the station platforms. And finally, I wasn't going to model any of the stairwells based on what was in the station, but rather I was simply going to model the stairwells based on the subway entrances outside of the station. With these last few details confirmed, I can finally settle in and start completing the station itself. Leading up to this station visit, I did work on the station platforms in the surrounding area on the layout. The station platforms needed to be elevated slightly above the railheads, so I added a smooth base of 1/4-inch plywood between the rails as well as the base of the station and the elevated area east of the Spadina Bridge. The station platforms will be installed permanently, but I want the station and all of the surrounding backdrop buildings to be mounted on removable bases so that I can work on the structures and the scenery at my desktop as opposed to leaning over the layout. The concrete platforms themselves were made using sheet styrene. I 3D printed some basic stairwells that don't descend to the full depth of the prototype, but rather have 5 or 6 gentle steps that should create the illusion of stairs descending below the rails. With decisions now made about the supports and having base material laid down for the station and surrounding areas, I should be able to transition from thinking about the layout to working on the layout. Every April, the Doubleheaders Layout Club hosts a regional layout tour that features layouts between the Waterloo region and the Guelph areas. This year there was over 20 layouts, and rather than do the tour myself, I helped my good friend exhibit his layout for the day. There was a steady flow of traffic throughout the day. It was a lot of fun to meet some new faces, and I was genuinely surprised by the number of people that recognized me from past videos. We entertained visitors for well over 10 hours, and people were genuinely impressed and grateful for the layout visit. And that feedback was really appreciated, because unfortunately, this was the last time anyone was ever going to see Darren's Northland layout. I have a number of friends who have seen some life changes in the past few months, and this was no exception. And so while visitors were coming in to see the layout, that time was also spent selling off all of the rolling stock, memorabilia, and the layout in and of itself. Thankfully, by the end of the day, almost everything was sold, and by the end of the following week, the basement empire was completely gone, and the basement was returned to its original state. I was very grateful for the opportunity to work with Darren all day long, and I was very fortunate that I was able to get a few things from Darren's collection. I now have a pair of CN lanterns, a small Ontario Northland flag, and 2 small red plaques from inside an engine cab. Interestingly, the one sign has a small dent in the center of it, which is actually a bullet hole that occurred while the train was traveling between Windsor and Detroit. Someone actually shot at the cab, through the window, and hit the sign behind the engineer's head. Maybe not a great story, but an interesting story nonetheless. And finally, I was able to get a pair of crossing signals for the layout room. I have no idea how I'm going to mount these from the ceiling, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to have a pair of working signals in my basement. In addition to this, I also received a gift in the mail, as well as made some new purchases. Firstly, my friend Tim from They Make It Like That was generous enough to send me some of his new N-scale garbage dumpsters. Tim has been printing, painting, and graffitiing these small dumpsters and has been selling them online with a lot of positive feedback. He sent me my own set of 4, and these things are fantastic. If you're interested in your own set of dumpsters, I'll include a link in my bio to Tim's channel, and I suggest you subscribe and follow him along as he's working on his own new urban layout. I also made a purchase this month from Outland Scale Models. Earlier in the video I mentioned how progress had slowed as prototype modeling can get so detail-oriented that it becomes difficult to move forward with any sort of speed. And so I have started making a number of compromises on how I want to approach my modeling. One of the key structures on the layout is Toronto's Union Station, and I've decided that rather than try to make something that's 100% prototypically accurate, I'm going to kit bash a reasonable facsimile. So in this case, one of the small apartment complexes offered by Outland Models has front and rear facing windows on the building that I've decided will be adequate stand-ins for my original design. The building sections are 4 stories tall, and the window placement is close enough to the original that when I'm done constructing this 3-foot long station, a casual observer will likely not understand the difference between the prototype and my version of the prototype. I also purchased another pair of tower kits, the exact same kits I used for my original graffiti towers project. Although I don't have a plan for the new towers, I know that I'm going to need a lot more tall buildings as I model the downtown core. So this is the point in the video where I would have returned to Union Station and summed up the month's activities. But things don't necessarily always go to plan. And when I think about it, maybe that's really the theme for April. I've made changes in how I want to approach modeling signature pieces on the layout. A fellow modeler has had to abandon a basement empire, as life changes sometimes mean that we need to start over. And I've decided to strike a balance between scratch building and kit bashing in order to remain focused on the big picture and not get swallowed up in the details. Overall, April was a great month. I had lots of fun. And as always, I appreciate you for tuning in and joining me on my adventures. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.